Hi, my name is Sean Stark, and for case study number one, I'm studying carnitine acylcarnitine translocase deficiency. For the case study overview, it's about an infant named Jim D that died after 4 days after birth following an episode of cardiac arrest. Jim D had one healthy older sister, and the parents ended up going on to have a second son named Carrie who experienced seizures and respiratory failure after 36 hours of birth. The labs for Carrie showed that he had excess long chain fatty acids in his bloodstream. They ended up feeding him frequent meals low in fatty acids, but he was still having symptoms of the disease. Carrie ended up passing at the age of 2, almost 3 years old, from respiratory failure as a result of the disorder. I chose this case because I'm not as familiar with diseases that affect children or even the more rare metabolic disorders. I work with geriatric patients and I see a lot of metabolic disorders, but not some of these things that cause so many serious issues. I'm kind of also stuck between specializing in pediatrics or cardiology, so I kind of like the fact that both of these things were reflected in this case study. For some background information, the CATC, which is the carnitine acylcarnitine translocase, that's an enzyme that's responsible for transport of the long chain fatty acids across the mitochondrial membrane, where it can then be oxidized for some energy. So the fatty acids become oxidized via the beta oxidation pathway located within the mitochondria. The CATC also allows synthesis and oxidation to occur at different times and is present in all tissues and is especially important for cardiac, liver, and skeletal muscle. And then the fatty acids are used as a source of energy for muscles of humans during periods of prolonged fasting or long-term exercise. So the carnitine cycle as a whole is responsible for transporting long-chain fatty acids from the cytosol across the mitochondrial membrane to the mitochondrial space where the fatty acid beta oxidation can occur. The beta oxidation also provides the main source of energy for the muscles during those periods of prolonged fasting or long-term exercise. And the carnitine acylcarnitine translocase is essential during this cycle because it mediates the exchange of the long-chain fatty acids for free carnitine. So these are the steps of the carnitine cycle. The first step is that carnitine is taken up by the cell and moved across the plasma membrane by means of the transporter here. In this case, it's called the OCTN2. And you can see that right under the carnitine here. Next, the acyl groups become acyl-CoA to carnitine via the carnitine palmitotransferase 1, which is CPT1, right below that. And it passes through the outer mitochondrial membrane. Next, the acylcarnitine is transported across the inner mitochondrial membrane here. And the acyl groups are transferred from acylcarnitine to CoA inside of the mitochondria through CPT2, which is located just below that. From there, the beta oxidation can occur, and it can go on to undergo the citric acid cycle to generate energy. So for the CACT deficiency, it's inherited in an autosomal recessive manner, and that means that both parents must carry a copy of the gene in order for the offspring to inherit it. The parents would not be affected by the disease. They would carry a dormant version of the mutation, and the child would inherit one of each from each parent and carry the disease. If they were affected, those parents could also have unaffected children or children that are carriers of the disease as well. And I'll explain that further. The deficiency is encoded by the SLC25 alpha 20 gene, which one copy of that gene is inherited from each parent, which makes it autosomal in nature. The deficiency is expressed more in the heart, liver, and skeletal muscle, and you'll see that a little bit when I explain the symptoms. It has a very high mortality rate. There are no known survivors of the disease that I could find. It mostly presents during the neonatal period or in early infancy. So although some children have lived beyond early infancy, but most have passed away before the age of 2 or 3. It also only affects a very small number of individuals. There were only 55 as of 2015 with that case study. It affects humans because the transport of the CACT fatty acids is essential for long-chain fatty acid oxidation. And like I said, that occurs via the beta oxidation pathway. The CACT deficiency means basically that long-chain fatty acids become unavailable for the beta oxidation within the mitochondria, and it kind of depletes the energy stores that cannot undergo that oxidation. In other words, basically the mutation causes a structural change of the carnitine acetylcarnitine translocase enzyme, which would render it non-functional or would just inhibit formation entirely. So for some early symptoms of the disease, they would include severe neurological damage. That would include things like hypersomnia, which is sleeping often, behavioral changes. It would also include liver dysfunction, more specifically hepatomegaly, which means an enlarged liver, muscle weakness, cardiomyopathy, which is a type of heart disease that could either be categorized by thickened heart muscle or enlarged heart chambers, and that can lead to arrhythmias, heart block. And the arrhythmias in Jim's case would be cardiac arrest. Hyperammonemia, which is an elevated ammonia level in the blood. I've seen this in many of my patients. It causes encephalopathy, which can induce those behavioral changes, and seizures as well. Hypoketotic hypoglycemia, which would be low blood sugar. And then late symptoms would include severe metabolic decompensation, and which could include the vomiting, diarrhea. It'd be metabolic wasting, and then death either in infancy or in early childhood. The prognosis is not great. In severe cases, a child can die during the neonatal period or during early infancy, like I said. In the more mild cases, though, the child may live into early childhood, but usually pass before the age of around 3. But the disease in itself always results in death of the affected child. So for treatment of the deficiency, you'd want low meals and low in fatty acid, and high in carbohydrates. You would want even higher carbohydrate intake during periods of illness as well. And then they would supplement lipids as medium chain triglycerides and essential polyunsaturated fatty acids. In Carrie's case, he was able to receive food that was low in fatty acids for a prolonged period of time to prevent the accumulation of fatty acids in his bloodstream. But another way of preventing the fatty acid buildup outside of dietary changes would be to administer levocarnitine. That would aid in the transport of long-chain fatty acids across the mitochondrial membrane. So kind of reverse the impact of the disease. Those doses for that administration would be based on body weight. So if you're a carrier and that means you don't have the mutation, you don't have the disease. As you can see in this figure, an unaffected carrier father and mother would have a 25% chance of having an unaffected child, a 50% chance of having a child that is a carrier, and then a 25% chance of having an affected child. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's lethal because the overall mortality rate is 100%, even though it varies in age of death per the individual. The mutation is not spontaneous in nature, so it is inherited in an autosomal recessive manner, which basically means that both parents have to be carriers of the disease in order for the offspring to have it. Since 100% of the affected individuals die from the disease within years of birth, but carriers such as Jim's older sister, who is healthy and did not have the disease, will continue to have the potential to pass on the gene onto their offspring. The disease is considered fatal from an evolutionary standpoint, but not an individual standpoint because of that. Because the carriers are able to continue to pass on that gene to their offspring, and it's 100% lethal. So one important symptom of cardiomyopathy that's consistent with the site of abnormality in the cell is cardiomyopathy. CACT deficiency, and like I said, inhibits long-chain fatty acids from being transported into the mitochondria. That means that the fatty acids accumulate in the cell and then cause damage to the muscles of the liver, heart, and various other muscles throughout the body. The cardiomyopathy is a kind of heart disease, like I said, that is specific to the heart muscle. One type is dilated cardiomyopathy, that basically means that the ventricles are enlarged. The other form is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is shown on the right here. And as you can see at the bottom of that photo, the heart muscle is enlarged, and those can cause, like I said, arrhythmias and heart failure as well. So for mitochondrial DNA, the case study said that his mother felt guilty after finding out that mitochondrial DNA is inherited from only the mother, and that is true. It is definitely inherited by only the mother. However, with this disease, the mutation occurs outside of the mitochondria. It actually occurs in the cytosol, and that makes it doesn't make it a mitochondrial mutation. So basically the CATC protein transport fatty acids from the cytosol to the mitochondria for oxidation. So this mutation does not occur in the mitochondria. For the child to have disease, both parents would have to be carriers, and although both parents would not have the disease themselves. So like I said before, 25% of chance of the child inheriting the disease, 25% chance of them being unaffected, and then a 50% chance of each child being a carrier. So how this relates to genetics, I found that it relates to genetics because we discussed topics in this course as like inheritance, and I liked that this showed recessive versus or autosomal versus mitochondrial inheritance. While autosomal recessive mutations occur only when both parents are carriers, mitochondrial mutations are only passed on by the mother. Both of these methods of inheritance can affect either sex of the offspring, but if a male offspring inherits mitochondrial mutation, he won't pass on the mutation to his offspring. And this is my reference page, which is also included in the overview document that I attached. Thank you.